Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello everyone, welcome back. In our previous session, we explored the causes and unfolding of the global financial crisis, including the housing bubble, the banking meltdown, and the role of financial innovations like subprime mortgages, backed securities, and collateral debt obligations. We also saw how these shocks destabilize economies worldwide. Today, we turn to a crucial question. How do policymakers respond to such crises? So, specifically, we will focus on the role of fiscal policy and monetary policy in stabilizing the economy in the course of such shock or crisis. At first glance, it might seem straightforward, very straightforward. When the economy contracts, you know that the policy response will be like this: government should spend more, or they cut taxes, and the central bank should lower interest rates so that the liquidity with the banking system and in the economy increases. But in practice, it's not that simple. Policy actions take time, and these delays, known as policy lags, can weaken or even undermine their effectiveness. So, in this session, we will examine several types of lags associated with the policy. One is called information lags, the delay in even knowing a problem exists. And second one, implementation lag, the time it takes to design and pass a policy. And third, inside and outside lags, the delay both in making decisions and seeing their effects. So, the differences between fiscal policy and monetary policy lags will be discussed, as well as the debate between rules versus discretion also will be discussed. By the end of today's session, I hope you will understand why timely intervention is so difficult, and why sometimes even well-intentioned policies risk arriving too late or being too strong. So, this will help us appreciate the challenges policymakers face when trying to fight recession and financial crisis. So, let me begin with the first lag, that is called information lag. So, what we normally assume in the macroeconomic theories is that we assume that policymakers see what is happening in the economy and can instantly alter policies to fix any problem. But in the real world, there is an information lag, a delay between a change in the economy and the knowledge of that change. For example, so are we in a recession right now? How do we know it? Because at present, in this present, maybe this last 1 month, are we in a recession? How do we know it? So, this actually a very tricky question, because it's very difficult to know, to understand whether are we in a recession or not. So, in one of previous sessions, we have discussed several unconventional tools to see whether the economy is going through a recession. For example, whether the households are spending less, and we even discuss some garbage index, something like that, that we discuss. The idea here is to see whether are we currently going through recession or not. So, in the US, the Business Cycle Dating Committee within the NBER has the responsibility of determining when a recession begins and when it ends. Then the issue here is that because we mentioned that a recession means when the actual output is below the potential output. Then the issue comes here, there is some kind of uncertainty about the potential output. So, the one macroeconomic policy goal, as we discussed in several of our previous session, is to keep output or GDP as close as to the potential output as possible, so that the economy realizes full potential and then all factors of production are fully employed. Then the query comes here, what is potential output? Because I mentioned in one of the previous session, especially when we are discussing the GDP concept, at that time I discussed that, you are already familiar about that. Potential output means that is the output that we make a forecast based on the actual output, because the potential output we cannot observe, that we are drawing a trend line based on the actual output. So at a given period of time, it is difficult to identify the potential output because there are uncertainty surrounding this potential output. So the idea here is that if we are not clear, not certain that whether we are already read the potential output, or at present the observed or the actual output is equal to the potential output, or whether it is above or below, then if we are not clear about that, for example, at that time if that part is not clear, suppose our current output is, for example, above, the actual output is above the potential output, and at that time if we are using an expansionary fiscal policy or an expansionary monetary policy. For example, expansionary fiscal policy means increase in government spending and decline in cut in taxes, and similarly expansionary monetary policy means cut in rate of interest and injecting more money into the economy. So if you do this one when the actual output is above the potential, it would cause inflation, because already during that means when the actual output is above potential output means economy is at a boom stage. Already at the boom, inflation is already high, and at that time if the central bank injects more money into the economy, it will make hyperinflation. And similarly, if the policymakers use contractionary policy when the economy is actually below the potential output, then they create unnecessary unemployment. You know that when the actual output is below the potential output, already the economic activities have been contracting. At that time, if they increase cut and if they increase tax, if they reduce government expenditure, and if they increase the interest rate, it all will further, it will accelerate the contraction of the economy, and it will further lead to unnecessary unemployment. So the key point here is that because of all these things, the policy identifying the issue and the policy identifying the crisis and also acting, all these become important. So then coming to this one, relating this one to fiscal and monetary policy, let us discuss now the policy implementation lag. Suppose the economy is at full employment, and suppose and is affected by a negative aggregate demand disturbance, that means aggregate demand is less than aggregate supply, you know that it reduces equilibrium level of income below full employment. And in order to happen this, that is a deficiency of demand, that's a demand side shock. So for us, there is no advance warning of such a disturbance. So no policy action can be taken in anticipation of its occurrence. For example, the COVID shock, the COVID crisis, at that time it's a crisis, it led to, it was an economic shock as well, but there was no warning, policymakers were not aware that COVID is coming. So then policymakers must take some decision, they must decide should they respond to the disturbance, yes or not, and if so, if they decide that they need to respond, if so, how should they respond? So how should they respond, whether by fiscal policy or by monetary policy or a mix of both, and even if monetary policy, what kind of intervention, what is the magnitude of the intervention, even in fiscal policy and monetary policy, what is the magnitude of the intervention, that they have to decide. So all this would lead to a policy implementation lag, that is a delay between the time policymakers recognize the need for a policy action and when the policy is actually instituted. So there will be a lag. And the policy making, you know that is a process. It takes time to recognize and implement a policy action, be it a monetary policy or a fiscal policy. It takes time to recognize the problem, that there is a financial crisis is there, or is worth to intervene, or the magnitude of the crisis is worth to have a policy implementation. Then subsequently it takes time for an action to work its way through the economy. So each steps, it involves delays or lags. So one is called inside lag. Broadly, this policy implementation lag, we can categorize it into two lags. One is called inside lags and the other one is called outside lags. So let us discuss this one by one. In the inside lags, there is recognition lags and there is decision lags, then action lags. So let us go one by one. Moving to the first inside lag is called recognition lag. Recognition lag is the period that elapses between the time a disturbance occurs and the time the policymakers recognize that action is required. So the recognition lag becomes negative if the disturbance is predicted. They already know, the policymakers already aware that the disturbance is going to take place, predicted, and appropriate policy actions are considered before it occurs. You know, especially during Christmas time and Diwali time, the central banks they increase money supply. In India, especially during Diwali time, because RBI predict that at that time there is an increase in aggregate demand and people need more money to buy goods and services. So then at that time the central bank increases money supply mainly through the banking system. The liquidity with the banking system increases and people get cheap credit. In the Western world, normally during Christmas time and New Year time, central bank increase money supply. That means there is no lag. That means the disturbance, the increase in aggregate demand is going to take place during this period, but the policymakers are responding well in advance. That is a negative. There is a lag is actually negative, but mostly in practice, mostly the lag is typically positive, especially when the crisis for crisis, because most disturbance, that the economic disturbance is unpredictable, and as a result, policymakers come to know this disturbance only after it has hit the economy. Then comes the second kind of lag, that is called decision lag. Decision lag is the delay between recognition of the need for action, whether policy intervention is required or not, then the policy decision. So it differs. Policy decision means what kind of policy they need to implement. So it differs between monetary and fiscal policy. So in the US, fiscal policy has a longer implementation lag because policy must be formulated, because to fight against the crisis, first it has to be formulated, then legislation passed by the Congress and signed by the President. It all will take time. So as a result, you can see there is a longer implementation lag. And in contrast to this, the monetary policy has such a shorter implementation lag because the Federal Open Market Operation Committee decides monetary policy and implement it immediately, because FOMC meets regularly to discuss and decide on policy. So shortly, what I am saying here is that for the fiscal policy there is longer implementation lag, whereas for monetary policy there are shorter implementation lag. So let's now move to the third lag, that is called action lag, that come under the inside lags. So this is a lag between the policy decisions and its implementation. And this action lag also differs between monetary policy and fiscal policy, because monetary policy makers typically act immediately, because as I mentioned, FOMC they meet regularly, and in India monetary policy committee also, they also take action immediately. But when it comes to fiscal policy, their actions are less rapid. What we discussed so far is all about the inside lag. Then let us move to the outside lag. Outside lag means the time it takes a policy measure to work its way through the economy. So when a fiscal policy is implemented or when a monetary policy is implemented, how much time it takes to make an impact on the target key economic variables. So inside lags are discrete, as we already discussed, but outside lags are typically distributed lags. Once a policy action has been taken, its effects on the economy are spread out over time. So you can see that immediate impacts may be small, but other effects occur later. Maybe for one type of policy, maybe you can see that there is an immediate impact, but for some other kind of policy, there may be a longer time will be required to make a true impact on the economy. So this also we can discuss between fiscal policy and monetary policy. How does the outside lag varies between fiscal policy and monetary policy? The monetary policy, you know that how it works. You know that monetary policies mostly they reduce rate of interest, and when the rate of interest is reduced, then the cost of production for the firms, because the firms are getting cheap credit and the consumers are getting cheap credit to buy durable goods. So as a result, initially is going to impact the investment by firms and the demand for durable goods by consumers through changes in the interest rate, but not through income. So when aggregate demand ultimately affected, increase in spending itself produces a series of induced adjustment in output spending. So simply let me put it in line by line. Suppose the central bank is implementing a monetary policy, that means they are following an expansionary monetary policy to fight against the crisis. Then how it works is that when the central bank reduces rate of interest, for the firms, for them they interpret it as that the rate of interest has declined, the cost of borrowing money from the financial market has declined, and then they will be expanding their operation. They are investing more in the purchase of capital goods, that the machines, and expanding the size of factory. And then you know that in order to do that, they will be hiring more laborers, more raw materials, inputs and all. Then you know that when they are hiring more laborers, employment opportunities increases. And then finally, when inputs are transformed into output, you can see that output has been increased. So in the entire process, you can see that there will be a lag. Then coming to fiscal policy, just for instance, take an expansionary fiscal policy such as increase in government expenditure or decline in tax rates. So when the government expenditure is increased, when government is spending lots of money in the economy, you know that it directly affecting the aggregate demand, because when government is spending, immediately there is a increase in demand for goods and services in the economy. So that means it's directly affecting aggregate demand. But monetary policy, it takes time, as I mentioned, because declining rate of interest, then the firms responding with expanding their operations, and then the economy responding accordingly, then it would take, that means it's generating employment opportunities and people income increasing, then their aggregate demand is increasing. So then clearly we can make a distinction here between monetary policy and fiscal policy lags, especially for the monetary policy, which I already mentioned. The inside lag that we discussed, that the inside lag is very short for monetary policy, because monetary policy committee or FOMC, they can take a decision within a short span of time, but to make an impact in the economy, that the outside there is a lots of lags. For example, if you highlight the data provided by Friedman and other monetarists, they believe that changes in the money supply will have a strong effect on income, but that there is a lag, with the bulk of the effect occurring only after 6 to 18 months. So you can see the lag that is taking place. That means nearly 6 to 18 months time the monetary policy is taking that much time to make an impact. Thus, to offset a shock, we must be able to predict its size and when it will affect the economy several quarters in advance. So Friedman and the other monetarists do not think that we know enough to do this, because there is a recognition lag in the economy, because it's difficult to predict whether an economy is falling into recession or not. In contrast to this, fiscal policy, as I already mentioned, is directly affects aggregate demand, and there is a shorter outside lags than monetary policy. But we have already seen that monetary policy has longer inside lags than monetary policy. So long inside lags will make fiscal policy less useful for stabilization or used less frequently to stabilize the economy. So it takes time to set the policies in action, and then the policies themselves take time to affect the economy. So then there are further difficulties arise, because policymakers cannot be certain about the size and timing of the effects of policy actions. So in addition to this, the expectations and reactions of different economic agents also make the issue more worse. And the government uncertainties about the effects of policies on the economy arise mainly because policymakers do not know what expectation firms and consumers have. For example, about the fiscal policy and about the monetary policy. And for example, they already, if suppose to fight against the recession, suppose the planned monetary policy is to reduce the rate of interest, and similarly fiscal policies increase in government expenditure. What if already the firms and consumer already formed an expectation, they know already that the policymakers are going to act in these ways. So if they already know, whether they know it or not, if there is an uncertainty, suppose if they already know it, so all the firms and consumers will act accordingly well in advance. So if that is their expectation, and then the policymakers do not act in the same way, then that would lead to much uncertainty in the economy, and then the policy effects may not take place. And then government doesn't know the true model of the economy, because there is uncertainty about the true model of the economy. So they work with the econometric models of the economy in estimating the effects of policy changes, but what is the true effect of such policies? That is, there is uncertainties there. And coming to more about the uncertainty and economic policy, because policymakers can go wrong in using active stabilization policy due to, first, about the uncertainty about the expectation of firms and consumers, that is one. Second one is about the difficulty in forecasting disturbances. So because of that, the lack of knowledge about the true structure of the economy, because of all these things, there will be uncertainty about the correct model of the economy. And further, there is uncertainty about the precise values of the parameters within a given model of the economy. And after discussing the different types of lags, that the inside lags and outside lags, and also discussing it between how does it vary between fiscal policy and monetary policy, and when coming to whether how should policymakers respond to a crisis. Broadly, there are two schools of thought who argues differently. One, the Friedman, the monetary school, they argue that it's better to follow a rule-based approach, because he and associate argue mainly for monetary policy, because to him and the colleagues, money is the key factor that affects most of the economic parameters, variables, and money is the most single economic variable that clearly explain the variation in output and employment. And then his argument is that there should be no use of active counter-cyclical monetary policy. He argued that monetary policy should be confined to making the money supply grow at a constant rate. Suppose the economy is growing, if they predicted to grow at 5% rate, then the money supply also grow at a 5% rate. So they followed a simple monetary policy rule. That means the Fed shouldn't respond to the condition of the economy. Instead, they should increase money supply, change the money supply in line with the GDP growth rate. In contrast to this, the Keynesian economists argue that they believe in a discretionary monetary policy. They believe that policies that respond to the current or predicted state of the economy. So they will argue for a activist policy, that is a discretionary policy. For example, when the economy is under crisis, at that time their recommendation is that the government should spend more, the purchasing power of the people should be increased, the aggregate demand should be rejuvenated, incentivized, and that kind of policy they should follow when the economy is in crisis. So when the economy is back to normal, then they don't need any discretionary policy. So they recommend this activist policy mainly when the economy is in crisis. So that is the two broad groups of economic policies. One is rule-based policies. That means rule-based policy means don't respond to economic crisis. That means we don't know exactly whether the economy is in recession or in boom. So suppose we wrongly understand the economy, then we use a wrong policy, then it will escalate the magnitude of the problem. So then they recommend that it is better to follow a rule-based policy. In contrast, as I already mentioned, Keynesians argued that we need to have discretionary or activist policy, especially when the economy is in crisis. So understand the magnitude of the problem, then respond accordingly to take the economy back to track. So overall, in determining how policymakers should operate, policymakers must answer several questions. One is, should policymakers actively try to offset shock? If yes, should response be pre-committed to specific rules, or should policymakers work on a case-by-case basis? So apart from the main policy aspect that we discussed, there are some other confounding factors as well, not only the lags that we discussed. In addition to the inside lag and outside lags, there are some other confounding factors as well that also affect the effectiveness of these policies. One is banks reluctant to lend. Suppose, as I already mentioned here, normally during a crisis time, the monetary policy is mostly expansionary. They reduce the rate of interest, then increase the liquidity with the banking system. And you know that especially during crisis time, the default risk is going to be very high, and during that time the bankers will be reluctant to lend to the firms and consumers. You know that during crisis time or the economic recession time, already the net worth of the firms are very low, the income of consumers and households are also very low. So then banks will be reluctant, they will be afraid that, because they are getting cheap money from the central bank, but they will be reluctant to lend it to the firms and the banks because of the high default risk. They already know that the stock market is to be doing poorly and the income of households are already at a low level. So even despite lower interest rate and increased demand for investments, banks may be unwilling to make the loans necessary for the investment purchases. So if banks made prior bad loans that are not repaid, may become reluctant to make more despite there is an increasing demand. So this is the reason during crisis time the conventional monetary policy and fiscal policy won't work. Instead they follow unconventional fiscal and monetary policy, so that the money or the increase in aggregate demand, it directly reaches out the economy, or the money, the liquidity injection also directly reaches out the economy. And then also depends the soundness of the economic and political institutions and system, because as I already mentioned, suppose the central bank reduce rate of interest and the firms get cheap loans, so as a result the cost of borrowing declines. But the issue is that in order to match up with that, whether do they have the required managerial and technical skill, because when they are getting more cheap credit, so they should be acquiring new machines and plants, whether the economy is in a condition to provide sufficient machines and plants, and also whether they will be getting timely skilled labor and raw materials when they are expanding the firm's activities. So let me move to the concluding session here. So what we discuss here, that we discuss mainly the policy lags in fighting economic crisis. We already saw here that economic crisis demand quick policy responses. However, there are lags which make this difficult. So there are information, decision and implementation delays which all slow down fiscal and monetary actions. And we have already also seen that fiscal policies have larger inside lags but potentially powerful impact because of the shorter in the outside lags. In contrast to this, monetary policy has a faster implementation or inside lags, faster implementation, but the effects are spread over time. You know that is nothing but there is longer outside lags. So importantly, balancing timely action and long-term stability remains the core of policy challenges. Thank you for watching this session, and see you in the next session. Thank you.